Maria had always believed in the concept of freedom. She and her husband Tom had entered into an open marriage years ago, agreeing that both would have the freedom to explore their desires and needs outside their relationship. It was supposed to be an arrangement that would strengthen their bond, keep their marriage fresh, and allow them to be their true selves. But as time passed, Maria began to notice something disturbing. Tom, a high school teacher, had become more distant. His affection for her had faded, and his late-night stays at work were becoming more frequent. Maria didn't mind the idea of Tom seeing other people, but she was beginning to feel like he was withdrawing from their family. They had two children, Sam and Lily, both of whom adored their father. But Maria's growing concerns about Tom's behavior overshadowed her trust in him. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Maria went through Tom's desk drawer in search of answers. She was not proud of this breach of privacy, but something urged her to do it. As she rifled through the papers, she found a folder filled with photographs, letters, and notes. Some of these were of a woman Maria did not recognize, a woman who seemed to be much younger than her. But it wasn't just the photographs that shocked Maria, it was the letters. They spoke of secret meetings, promises of love, and even plans for a future together. Maria felt her heart drop. Tom had been hiding this from her, and she couldn't understand why. But as she read through the final letter, the truth became clear. Tom had been having an affair with this woman for months, and it was clear that he was planning to leave Maria. She sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the realization crashing down on her. The betrayal hit her like a wave. Not only had he been unfaithful, but his actions were now jeopardizing the security of their family. Maria's first thought was to confront Tom, but as she thought about the consequences, how this would devastate their children, how he might leave her, an even darker thought crept into her mind. What if Tom wasn't just planning to leave? What if he had other plans for their family, plans that could harm them? Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She needed answers, and she needed them quickly. But she also knew that she couldn't let her children grow up in a broken home. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that Tom was hiding more than just an affair. He had secrets that could destroy everything she had worked for. Her mind raced with the possibilities. What if he was planning something terrible for her or the kids? Maria knew she had to act fast. The idea of confronting Tom head-on seemed too dangerous, but doing nothing was not an option. In the end, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She would protect her children at all costs, even if it meant taking matters into her own hands. She began to plan, but she had no idea how far the consequences would stretch, or how an experienced investigator would soon be on her trail. Maria sat in the living room, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Her hands trembled slightly as she replayed the events of the past few hours. She had uncovered Tom's betrayal, and the fear of losing him, and perhaps even the safety of her children, was overwhelming. But the more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that she couldn't let him get away with it. She couldn't risk Tom leaving her for another woman, especially not with the children still so young. Tom had always been a good father, but she now realized that he was capable of something far worse than she had imagined. He had kept this affair hidden for so long, and now it seemed that he was planning to leave her behind. Maria couldn't bear the thought of being a single mother, struggling to raise their children without him. She had always relied on Tom, and the idea of him abandoning her felt like the ultimate betrayal. But there was more to it than that. Maria knew that if Tom was willing to hide something as significant as this affair, there could be even darker secrets lurking in the shadows. For days, Maria thought about her options. She didn't want to confront Tom directly. She had no idea how he would react, and the thought of a public confrontation with him terrified her. But she also couldn't ignore the fact that his behavior had been more than just careless. It had been reckless. If Tom was hiding things from her, Maria knew that he was willing to do anything to keep his secrets. That's when Maria's thoughts began to shift from simply protecting herself to protecting her children. Her love for Sam and Lily was stronger than any fear she felt for Tom. She needed to ensure that they would grow up in a safe environment, far away from Tom's influence if necessary. And if that meant taking matters into her own hands, she would do it. She spent the next few days carefully considering her plan. Maria had always been a meticulous person, and this time, she knew she needed to be even more careful. Tom had a routine, and Maria knew that if she timed things just right, she could take control of the situation before it got out of hand. She began to prepare herself for what she knew would be the hardest decision of her life. She needed to be calm and composed. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the best of her. Her children's future was at stake. She would act in the most efficient way possible, no matter what it took. Maria's plan took shape over the course of several days. She knew that Tom would be out late for a school event on Friday, and she decided that this would be the moment she would act. She had thought long and hard about how to make sure that Tom wouldn't have the chance to get away or to make things worse for her and the kids. The night before the event, Maria placed a few key items into a bag, things that she might need in case her plan went awry. A small knife, which she kept for protection, would be hidden in the bag. She also took the letters and photographs that she had discovered, knowing that they might be evidence she could use. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she couldn't back out now. She had made up her mind. As the evening approached, Maria's nerves were at an all-time high. She tried to calm herself by making dinner for the children, trying to keep her composure. She smiled at Sam and Lily, who had no idea what their mother was preparing to do. They were happy and unaware of the darkness creeping into their family's life. Finally, it was time. Tom kissed the kids goodbye and left for the school event. Maria waited for a few minutes before going to his office. Her hands shook as she stood in front of the door, knowing that once she entered, there would be no turning back. She unlocked the drawer and retrieved the weapon she had hidden. The plan was simple. She would confront Tom when he got home, make him see the truth about the damage he had caused, and stop him from leaving. She couldn't afford to let him ruin their family. Her heart broke at the thought, but in that moment, all that mattered was keeping her children safe. But Maria had no idea that this decision would set a chain of events in motion that would lead to more violence, more lies, and a ruthless investigation into the murder that would shake their community to its core. As Maria waited in the shadows, her mind raced. She was about to make the hardest decision of her life, and she didn't know if she could live with the consequences. But she was ready. Tom would never leave her, and her children would never suffer because of his secrets. She could only hope that she could live with the outcome. As the door to their house creaked open, Maria knew that there was no going back. Maria stood in the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. It was nearly midnight, and Tom was supposed to be home any minute. The silence of the house seemed oppressive, each tick of the clock echoing in her ears. She glanced at the small bag beside her hands trembling slightly as she ran her fingers over the edge. Inside was the knife, cold and heavy, a symbol of the decision she had made. The house was dimly lit, and the faint glow from the kitchen seemed to draw her attention. But she forced herself to stay focused. Her thoughts kept spinning around her plan, the weight of her actions bearing down on her. She didn't want to kill him. She didn't want this. But she believed that this was the only way to protect her children, to ensure that Tom could never hurt them or abandon them. It was a twisted sense of protection, but in her mind, it was justified. She heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Her pulse quickened, and she quickly slipped the knife into the waistband of her pants. She could hear Tom's footsteps on the front porch. The door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his face illuminated by the dim porch light. "Maria," Tom called out, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. "What are you doing up?" Maria stood motionless for a moment, the tension thick between them. Tom's eyes softened when he saw her, but it wasn't enough to shake the feeling that everything had changed. "I need to talk to you," Maria said, her voice unsteady but determined. She couldn't back down now. Tom raised an eyebrow, a faint smile crossing his lips. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maria stepped forward, and before she knew it, the words began pouring out, the anger and hurt spilling over. "I know about the affair, Tom. I know about her, and I know you were planning to leave me. You don't get to do this to me, to us." Tom's expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at her with a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "Maria, I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't mean for you to find out this way." Maria's eyes burned with unshed tears. She had never felt so betrayed in her life. She had trusted him, believed that their arrangement would keep their marriage intact, that it would give them the freedom to grow. But now it seemed like Tom had been plotting to abandon her, to leave her with nothing. "You didn't want to hurt me?" Maria repeated, her voice thick with disbelief. "You've been lying to me for months, Tom. You've been lying to our children. You've been planning to leave us. How is that not hurting us?" Tom stepped forward, reaching out to touch her arm, but Maria recoiled, her body stiffening. "Maria, please! I can't let you do this. I won't let you destroy our family," she snapped, her voice rising. The tension in her body was unbearable. She had made a decision, and now she had to follow through. Suddenly, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Maria felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal fear that pushed her forward. Her hands shook as she reached for the knife hidden at her side. She didn't want to do it, but the fear of losing her children, of losing everything, was too much. She swung the knife, desperation in her eyes. Tom's eyes widened in shock as the blade pierced his side. He gasped, stumbling backward, his hands clutching at the wound. "Maria, what are you doing?" he choked out, pain and confusion etched on his face. Maria's breath came in shallow gasps as she watched him collapse to the floor. She didn't know what she was doing anymore. The reality of her actions hit her like a freight train, but it was too late. Tom was bleeding on the floor, and Maria's world was falling apart. As she stood there, frozen in shock, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. She had just killed her husband. She had taken a life. The weight of what she had done began to crush her, but the voice in the back of her mind kept telling her that it was the only way to protect her children. She couldn't allow Tom to leave them. She couldn't risk him taking everything from her. For a long moment, Maria simply stared at the man she had once loved, now lying motionless at her feet. Blood pooled around him, and the reality of what she had done settled in. She hadn't intended for this to happen, but in that moment of rage and fear, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The sound of sirens suddenly filled the air, snapping Maria out of her stupor. Someone had heard Tom's cries for help. Someone had called for an ambulance, or maybe the police. Maria knew she had to act quickly. She couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when everything she had done was to protect her children. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing a cloth to press against Tom's wound in a futile attempt to stop the bleeding. But it was no use. He was already fading, slipping away from her grasp. Detective Samuel Clark had seen countless crime scenes in his years with the police force, but something about this one felt different. He had been called to the Patterson house around 2 a.m., a little more than an hour after the initial 911 call. The scene was chaotic, the house eerily quiet except for the hum of the forensic team working diligently. Tom Patterson had been discovered by his neighbor Linda, who had heard strange noises coming from the house. When she approached the front door, she found it wide open, and Tom was lying motionless in the hallway, a large pool of blood around him. The call to 911 had been made immediately, but it was clear that Tom's injuries were fatal. He had suffered a deep stab wound to his side, likely from a sharp object, and there was no indication that he had struggled, almost as if he had been taken by surprise. Detective Clark entered the house, adjusting his hat as he walked past the uniformed officers and into the living room. The house was immaculately kept, but the tension in the air was palpable. He glanced over at Tom's lifeless body, which had been covered with a white sheet, and then turned to the officers. "Any witnesses?" he asked, his deep voice breaking the silence. "No one saw anything, sir," Officer Marks replied. "Neighbors say they didn't hear anything until the scream." Clark nodded, making mental notes. "What about Maria, the wife?" "She's the one who called it in," Officer Marks continued. "She's in the back, in a state of shock. We're waiting on the paramedics to assess her before we can interview her." Clark rubbed his chin thoughtfully. He wasn't sure what to think yet, but the initial feeling was that this wasn't a random attack. Tom had been a well-known high school teacher, and his reputation in the community had been clean. There were no signs of break-ins or struggles. The idea of a burglar coming in and targeting just Tom seemed unlikely. And then there was the fact that Tom had been married for over a decade. What had led to this violence? As Clark walked to the back of the house, he passed by the children's rooms. He couldn't help but think about the devastation this would cause, especially for the young kids. He wondered what kind of woman Maria was and why this had happened in the first place. Maria was sitting in the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. She looked up when Clark entered, her hands tightly clasped together on the table. The air around her was thick with tension. She had clearly been through a traumatic experience, and Clark knew that now wasn't the time to rush her with questions. He needed to take a gentler approach. "Mrs. Patterson?" Clark asked softly, taking a seat across from her. "I'm Detective Clark. I'm sorry for what's happened, but I need to ask you some questions about your husband." Maria's lips quivered, but she nodded silently, her voice barely a whisper. I, I don't understand. I didn't mean for this to happen." Clark leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in concern. "Can you tell me what happened? What led to this?" Maria took a shaky breath and began to recount the events of the evening. She explained how Tom had come home late after attending a school event. She told Clark about the argument they had, how she had confronted him about the affair, and how he had tried to explain himself but seemed unwilling to change. There was pain in her voice, and Clark could sense the layers of emotion that had built up over the years. I, I didn't mean to hurt him," Maria continued, her eyes darting nervously to the floor. "But he was going to leave me. He wanted to leave us, leave the children. I couldn't let him do that. I couldn't lose everything." Clark listened carefully, nodding and understanding. It was clear that Maria was emotionally distraught, but there was something about her story that didn't add up. The way she spoke about the argument, the way she described the confrontation, it all felt too rehearsed. The detective's intuition was beginning to signal something wasn't right. "Tell me about the knife," Clark said after a moment. "Did you use a knife in the attack?" Maria froze, her face going white. Her hands clenched tightly around the edges of the table. I, I don't know. I didn't mean to." Her voice trailed off, the words failing to come together. Detective Clark studied her closely. He knew that trauma could cause people to act erratically, but something about her hesitation was telling him that she was hiding something. "The knife was found at the scene," Clark said slowly. "It was used to stab your husband. You need to be honest with me, Mrs. Patterson. This isn't something we can sweep under the rug." Maria blinked rapidly, her breathing shallow. She stood up suddenly, her voice rising. "I told you I didn't want to kill him. I didn't want any of this. I just, I just wanted to make him listen." Clark stood up as well, his gaze steady. The days following Tom Patterson's murder were filled with a quiet but growing tension. Detective Samuel Clark had left no stone unturned as he pieced together the details of the case. The more he dug into Tom's life, the more questions emerged. Maria had been released into her lawyer's custody, but Clark knew that her story was far from the full truth. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper lay beneath the surface. While he had her confession that she had killed Tom in a fit of desperation, the way she spoke about their marriage, her anger, the betrayal, felt off. He needed more answers. Clark had already visited the school where Tom taught. He had spoken to colleagues who painted a picture of a charismatic, dedicated teacher, respected by his students and peers alike. But they also revealed a side of Tom that Maria had not mentioned, his growing estrangement from his family, especially in the months leading up to his death. No one had seen the affair coming, but many remarked that Tom had been acting distant lately, almost as though he was preparing to leave his life behind. A crucial lead came from Tom's closest friend, James, who had worked with him for years at the school. James had seen the signs of trouble in Tom's marriage long before the murder. The two men had often talked about their personal lives after work, and Tom had confided in James about his affair with a younger woman named Emily. James told Clark that Tom had planned to tell Maria about the affair, but he had not yet found the right time. He had been trying to figure out how to break the news without completely destroying his family. However, James was unsure whether Tom had ever actually told her. Clark was intrigued by this information. Maria had confessed to knowing about the affair, but there was a discrepancy. She had seemed too prepared for it, as though she had known for longer than she let on. He needed to find out if Tom had indeed planned to leave Maria for Emily. If so, it would explain why he hadn't been home that night. But the murder still didn't make sense. Why would Maria kill him in such a violent manner? His next step was to investigate Tom's phone records and his emails. He knew that in today's digital age, most people left a trail of their actions online, and Tom was no exception. The phone records were a treasure trove of information. For the past few months, Tom had been in constant communication with Emily, both through calls and texts. Clark dug through the messages, uncovering a string of conversations filled with affection, plans for the future, and promises of a life together. It was clear that Tom had intended to leave Maria and start fresh with Emily. But there was something else, something unsettling that caught Clark's attention. Among the messages between Tom and Emily was a string of text messages from Maria to Tom. She had been contacting him with increasing urgency in the days before his death. The messages were filled with anger, frustration, and a hint of desperation. At first, they were short, accusing him of neglecting their family. But as the days went on, they became more intense, even pleading for him to come home and make things right. It was obvious that Maria was aware of the affair, but what was more alarming was her tone. She didn't seem to be acting like someone who had just discovered the betrayal. She seemed to be already in a state of panic, fearing that she was losing him. Clark noted the time of one particular message. It was sent just hours before the murder. Maria had texted Tom, demanding to know where he was and why he hadn't answered her calls. The tone of the message was sharp, and Clark couldn't help but wonder if Maria had suspected something darker was at play. Had she known that Tom was planning to leave her? Had she already begun plotting her next move? Clark decided to confront Maria with these new findings. He needed to see if she could explain the escalating tension in their marriage and her increasingly erratic behavior. He scheduled another meeting with her at the police station, where he had the phone records and messages laid out on the table. When Maria arrived, she was visibly shaken. Her lawyer had insisted that she was to remain silent, but Detective Clark was determined to get to the truth. "Maria, I have to be honest with you," Clark began, his voice calm but firm. "We've uncovered some troubling information. You said you didn't know about the affair, but we have evidence that you were in constant communication with Tom in the days leading up to his death. These texts, they don't sound like the messages of someone who just found out about the affair. They sound like someone who was already in crisis." Maria's eyes widened in shock. I, I don't know what you mean. I didn't kill him because of the affair. I couldn't lose him." Clark placed a set of text messages on the table. "These messages, Maria, they tell a different story. The investigation was nearing its climax. Detective Samuel Clark had been piecing together the puzzle of Tom Patterson's murder, and every lead seemed to pull him deeper into a tangled web of emotions, secrets, and lies. Maria's confession had provided a crucial piece of the story, but something still didn't feel right. Clark had his doubts, doubts that kept him up at night. He knew that Maria's emotional breakdown had some truth, but was it the full truth? Maria's actions on the night of Tom's death still didn't make complete sense. If she was so distraught, so desperate, why had she gone to such lengths to confront him that night? Had she truly killed him in a fit of passion, or had something more calculated driven her to murder? The pieces of the puzzle were still shifting, and Clark had to put everything in order. To understand the depths of Maria's emotions, Clark decided to visit her home. Her house, once a place of warmth, now felt cold and lifeless, as if the walls themselves were mourning the loss. He was met by Maria's lawyer, who stood at the door with a forced smile. "Detective Clark," the lawyer greeted him, a clear sign of the tension that still lingered between him and the police. "I assume you have more questions for my client?" Clark nodded, stepping into the house. "I think Maria has more to tell me. I need to hear everything, every detail." The lawyer hesitated but then agreed. "You have my permission to speak with her again." As Clark sat down across from Maria in her living room, he could see the weariness etched into her face. The weight of the past few days had clearly taken its toll. Maria looked like she hadn't slept in days, and her eyes were puffy, her face pale. "Maria," Clark began, his voice gentle but firm, "you said you killed Tom because you couldn't lose him. You were desperate, I understand that. But there's more here. I need you to be completely honest with me. I'm not here to judge you. I just need to know the truth." Maria lowered her gaze, staring at her hands. The silence stretched between them for several moments before she spoke. I didn't just kill him out of desperation, she said softly, her voice trembling. There was more to it. I wasn't just losing him. I was losing my family. I was losing everything. And I didn't think I could survive that. Clark leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Wasn't the affair the breaking point for you? Maria nodded, tears filling her eyes. Yes, but it wasn't just the affair. It was what I found out after I discovered it. I found something that changed everything. Clark's pulse quickened. What did you find? Maria hesitated for a long moment, as though the weight of the secret was too heavy to bear. But then, as if the floodgates had been opened, she finally spoke. I found out that Tom wasn't planning to leave me for Emily. Not really, she whispered. He wasn't planning to leave at all. He had been talking to someone else entirely. Emily wasn't the woman he wanted to be with. It was someone even closer. Clark's eyes narrowed. Who? Maria choked on her words. It was his student, Sarah Turner. Clark felt as if the floor had dropped beneath him. He was speechless for a moment, unable to grasp what Maria had just said. His student? He repeated, trying to make sense of it. Are you saying he was having an affair with a student? Maria nodded, her face twisted in pain. Yes, I found their messages on his phone. He had been seeing Sarah for months, even longer than he had been seeing Emily. They were planning to run away together, to start a new life. He was going to leave me and our children for her. He was going to destroy our family for her. Clark could see the devastation in Maria's eyes. It was a betrayal on an entirely different level, far beyond what he had initially thought. Tom had been planning to abandon his family, not for Emily, but for someone even younger, someone he should never have been involved with in the first place. The affair with Emily had been just the beginning, the cover for something far darker. I confronted him that night, Maria continued, her voice shaking with emotion. I showed him the messages. I told him I knew everything, but he didn't care. He just looked at me and told me that I was a fool, that I should let him go. He said I was too weak to understand what he really wanted, that I was just a part of his past. Tears streamed down Maria's face as she spoke. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just let him go. I couldn't let him destroy everything for the sake of some teenage girl. Clark sat back, taking in the full weight of her words. He had thought he had understood the motives behind Tom's death, but this new revelation changed everything. Maria hadn't just killed Tom out of fear of losing him. She had killed him out of a deep, agonizing sense of betrayal and a desire to protect her children from the devastation that Tom's actions would have caused. The days following Maria Patterson's confession were heavy. Detective Samuel Clark had done what he could to piece together the story from Maria's perspective. The affair, the betrayals, the secrets. But one last question lingered. Was the truth truly out? He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Turner. Maria had mentioned her as the one who had been involved with Tom, yet there was still one more piece of the puzzle missing. With Maria in custody, Clark turned his attention to the young student who had been the catalyst for the deadly confrontation. Sarah Turner had been a part of the story from the very beginning, and now it was time to see if her story matched Maria's. Clark contacted the local high school where Sarah attended. The principal was cooperative but seemed tense. Detective, I can't say I was aware of what was going on between Tom and Sarah, the principal explained. But Sarah's a good student. This doesn't make sense. Where is Sarah now? Clark asked, his patience wearing thin. The principal hesitated. She's been absent for the past few days. I know her parents were called in, but they haven't said much about her whereabouts. She's been troubled recently. We were hoping it was just stress from finals. Has anyone tried reaching her? Clark pressed. She's not answering her phone, the principal replied. We've tried. Clark's instincts told him something was wrong. He didn't believe Sarah was innocent in all of this. He had to find her. With the lead from the school, Clark managed to trace Sarah's whereabouts to a nearby apartment building. The apartment complex was run down, tucked away in a quiet corner of the town. It was a place Sarah wouldn't have been expected to visit, not by anyone who knew her. Clark rang the buzzer at the door of her apartment, his gut telling him that the answers he was searching for might be inside. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a woman in her late 40s, dressed in an old robe. Yes? She asked, eyeing Clark warily. I'm Detective Samuel Clark. I'm looking for Sarah Turner. Is she here? He asked, keeping his tone even. The woman's face went pale. What's this about? What has my daughter done? I need to speak to her. Is she here? The woman stepped back, her eyes shifting nervously. She hasn't been herself lately. She came here a few days ago, all shaken up. I didn't ask questions, but she's not here now. Clark didn't buy it. When did you last see her? The woman fidgeted, wringing her hands. She left the night of Tom Patterson's death, but she was different, scared. She told me she had to leave town, that she was running away from something, from someone. Clark's heart sank. He had expected this, but hearing the confirmation from Sarah's mother sent a shiver down his spine. He quickly glanced at the hallway leading into the apartment, searching for any sign of the young girl. Do you know where she went? Clark asked, his voice steady despite the urgency in his mind. I don't, the woman replied, her voice trembling. She didn't tell me. She just packed her bags and left. Said she was going to stay with a friend. Clark turned on his heel and stepped out of the apartment. There was no time to waste. He had to find Sarah before she disappeared for good. His first stop was Sarah's best friend, Laura. The two girls had been inseparable, and Laura was the person most likely to know where Sarah had gone. He drove across town, his thoughts racing as the minutes ticked by. When he arrived at Laura's house, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. Is Sarah here? Clark asked, his tone direct. Laura's eyes widened in surprise. Detective Clark? Why are you looking for her? Is she in trouble? I need to speak to her. Where is she? Laura hesitated. She's not here. I haven't heard from her since that night. Clark's frustration mounted. He had to find Sarah, but time was running out. He asked Laura to think carefully, hoping she might remember something that would lead him to Sarah's whereabouts. Laura paused for a moment before speaking. Wait, there's a place, a cabin in the woods. I think she told me she was going there before everything happened. She said it was a place to think, to get away from everything. Clark's heart raced. The cabin was isolated, and if Sarah was hiding there, it could be days before anyone found her. He thanked Laura and quickly made his way to the cabin. The drive was long, the road winding through dense woods. As Clark approached the small, weather-beaten cabin, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He stepped carefully out of the car, his hand on his gun just in case. He approached the door and called out, Sarah Turner! This is Detective Clark. I need to speak with you. There was no answer. Clark pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the cabin was dim, lit only by the light filtering through the windows. He moved cautiously through the room, his eyes scanning the area.